Good evening, everyone. This has been just an extraordinary day, and it's such a pleasure to be here with all of you. About 2 years ago, I found myself in a very strange position on the cutting edge of a viral phenomenon that I had not planned for, had not intended, and that took myself and my team completely by surprise. After 15 years as a corporate lawyer on Wall Street doing securities fraud litigation, and close to, at that point, 7 years as the CEO of a corporation that was dedicated to women's leadership and new models of leadership, and with a lifelong commitment to activism, I started writing to my friends on Facebook about our current political scenario. And shortly before the election, I found myself on a daily basis typing on Facebook, kind of nonstop, about what was happening as we approached the 2016 election. And after Trump was elected, I then got called upon by my friends on Facebook to explain what was happening in Washington. I had gone to law school in Washington, D.C. I had practiced law there for a couple of years before moving up to New York. And I had a real background in congressional investigations and high-profile white-collar crime and what happened when people broke the law and were corrupt. And so my friend said, we're really getting a lot out of this, but we have an idea. And my friend Amanda Steinberg, who many of you may know, founder of Daily Worth, very much in her own right, a women's rights activist around money, called me up one day and she said, Facebook has this new feature. You might want to check it out. And she said, you know, instead of spending all your spare time writing these things to us, you could just punch the live button. And I thought, that's not a bad idea. And so one afternoon, in the middle of my calls with corporate clients and my coaching calls with folks in the C-suite, I just punched the Facebook Live button and started talking to what at that time were 1,100 of my personal friends and colleagues. And every day, as we all know, this news cycle is so chaotic. I mean, I can't even believe the midterms were just 2 days ago. I found that I had more to say and more things to explain, and that people were writing to me and saying, can you answer this question? Can you explain what's going on? And so over the course of the next couple of weeks, I started broadcasting every day for about 20 minutes. Somewhere in that window, I still to this day do not know who did it, someone shared one of my broadcasts in the main Pantsuit Nation group, which at that time, shortly after the inauguration, had 3.5 million people in it. And very quickly, the phenomenon that is now known as Resistance Live went viral. My team, which at that point had really been dedicated just to doing corporate consulting on women's leadership and virtual training on women's leadership, suddenly saw our social media numbers on my personal Facebook page go from 1,100 to 5,000, 10,000, 20,000, 30,000, and all of a sudden we were exploding all over the place. We had no brand, we had no plan, but we knew that there was a service that we were offering that was really critical, that was fundamentally about this strange little nexus of mine related to leadership and law and activism. And so we knew we kind of had to go with it. But at a certain point, a little of the way in, I got a phone call from my COO. And she said, Elizabeth, we need to have a conversation. You're on Resistance Live every day. You're dropping F-bombs all the time. Some days you cry. You're out there speaking truth to power in a way that's really resonating with people. But I want to remind you that we have several $100,000 of consulting contracts with investment banks with very traditional masculine models of leadership operating, and you're getting kind of so big over here that if they find out about it, you might be jeopardizing what we've all been working to build for so long. And it was a real turning point for me, because I reached a moment in that conversation where I had to say to her, you know what? I don't care. Thank you. Because if what it costs us is some business, but what we are doing in return is giving people knowledge and skills and activism and language and the opportunity to learn how to educate others about what's happening in our government in ways that can build a better world, we need to do that. And I was very candid with my team that I didn't know where we were going. I said to them, frankly, I have no idea what's going to come of this, but what I know in my gut is that I can't be silent. And I was afraid, honestly, at certain points in this negotiation quite dramatically. I am the single mother of 2 young children. I am their sole source of financial support. I have worked my ass off my whole life to get to where I am right now, and it was not without risk. But in the end, the determination that we all had to make was that fundamentally there wasn't any choice. Now, one of the things that I will tell you about this weird kind of internet celebrity that I now have, and I'd had some tastes of this before. I'd been interviewed on CNN, I'd been on NPR, all around women's leadership and equal pay and those sorts of issues. I had never had people recognize me in the airport. I had certainly never had people send certified letters to my house that were threatening. I had never really had the experience of someone making death and rape threats against me on Twitter and having to report that. So there were moments in this that were fundamentally incredibly difficult. And I will also add that at a certain point, when you get that kind of level of exposure, your blind spots start to become very obvious. So one of the interesting things in this trajectory of my speaking truth to power is that at certain points earlier in this year, I was called out on several occasions by some very powerful black women about whether or not I was really representing black women's voices completely. And it was a very difficult, once again, calling on the carpet. But one of the things that I realized was that indeed, if I was going to speak truth to power, I needed to find ways to articulate with an understanding of my privilege. And so the outcome of this, one of the many outcomes of this, was that I was invited to the Black Women's Roundtable in Washington, D.C. in March. I was the only white woman in a room of 350 of the most powerful black women activists in the nation. People like Melanie Campbell, who runs the National Black Coalition on Civic Participation. That's the founding organization of the March on Washington. People like Nicole Lee, who was a spokesperson for the Mandelas in the United States and was the person who ran Nelson Mandela's memorial service here. And I was given the opportunity to sit and listen. And I will tell you that from a position of privilege, as a white woman, who obviously I've worked very hard and I own the work that I have put into where I found myself. But one of the keys that I learned about that is that sometimes when we want to speak truth to power and we have positions of privilege, one of the things we need to do first is just shut up and listen to the stories of other people. And so, as I progressed through this path over the last couple of years, a funny thing started to happen. About 6 months ago, one of my most significant corporate clients, major investment bank that has never had a woman on their board of directors and has only 2 women in managing director positions worldwide, one of those senior managing director women pulled me aside and she said, "Elizabeth, I have to tell you something." And I was like, uh-oh. And she said, "You're saving me every day." And I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "I'm watching that broadcast." And I was like, oh boy, here we go. You know, like the cat's out of the bag, the horse has left the barn, and I'm screwed. And what she said to me was, "No, wait a minute. We're actually looking for someone who can come into our organization and talk about creating safe spaces for women in this political environment. And we don't know anybody else who's doing that. We don't know anybody else who's sitting at this kind of really weird nexus of politics and women's leadership." And over the last few months, more and more, we have gotten asked to come in and do exactly that. And so in the long run, on a personal level, and I am one of those people who believes that we're all here for a purpose and a reason, and we all have certain gifts that can contribute to where we find ourselves right now in society. My path has led to this really sweet, very bizarre point where my speaking truth to power has allowed me to do that in venues like this, in some of the most significant corporations in the world, in ways that I never would have expected. So what does that mean for all of you? Well, one of the things that I want to point out in terms of where we find ourselves right now in women's leadership is that it's only 5 years ago that Lean In was published. I know it feels like forever, we're living through the Trump administration in dog years, but it literally was only 5 years ago that where we found ourselves in women's leadership was this idea. And I have dear friends inside Facebook. I know we have a lot of people here, but I will say that it has bothered me that Lean In, to some extent, required women to take responsibility for the effects of the discrimination that's been perpetrated against us. I will add that for me, in reading it, one of the painful moments there was being told that if I just leaned in and smiled a little bit more, it all would have been okay. We now are in a very different position. And what I will say is that I have seen much more in the last 2 years in particular of women being willing, instead of leaning in, to stand up and to say, I'm not willing to tolerate this anymore. Our organization is not inclusive enough. Our organization is not equitable. We have work we need to do here. And then, when that has not worked, we've actually seen women walking out. And I will say that, one example of this is just what we saw from Google in the last week, right? So we are moving on a trajectory now where the importance of speaking truth to power matters everywhere that we are operating in life. And so the question that I want to ask you all to kind of consider here as creatives is how you can use your gifts in furtherance of speaking truth to power. One of my favorite things about being in creative environments is that a lot of you in this room are storytellers. And this point has been made several times today, but it's worth mentioning also in the context of speaking truth to power. You have the capacity to create narrative. You have the capacity to tell history in ways that it is not erased. You have the capacity to predict the future to some extent in the ways in which you create representation now. And so speaking truth to power is not just about using your voice, it's also about using your gifts. My view from the very beginning of Resistance Live has been that within this effort that we are making right now to change the world, hopefully, to make it better, to fight back against so much, in my view, evil that we are seeing right now that's being perpetrated against so many of us, is that we have a critical obligation to share our gifts in furtherance of making the world a better place. I will add that this requires an understanding of intersectionality and privilege. So I was thrilled today, by the way, in one of the leadership panels to hear the name Kimberly Crenshaw shouted out. If you are not familiar with Kimberly's work, please go find it. She is the founding mother of the term intersectionality. One of the things that all of us in this room need to consider is that some of us have extreme privilege in the system that we are living in right now. We are white, straight, cisgendered, heterosexual, men, able-bodied, wealthy. Most of us in this room fall somewhere on the other spectrum of intersectionality, but everyone in this room, to some extent, has privilege that could be leveraged to make the world a better place. And just to show the contrast of this, I was thinking about this last night when I was at the hotel. On my way out here, I watched a video on Facebook. And it was a video of a young black man who had been standing on a street corner. And literally in the video, there's a cop pointing a gun at him. And he's saying, I'm not doing anything. I'm just standing here on a corner, and what you're doing is not okay. What you are doing to me right now is not okay. And an elder came up next to him and said, get down on the ground and put your hands behind your back, because it is not worth it. They are killing us in these streets, and you don't want to die for this. No one in this room, in a meeting, if you went into your boss, if you went to the CEO and said, I'm really concerned about equity and inclusion in our organization, is going to have to worry about being shot. And so to the extent that you have the capacity to leverage your privilege, my view is that your obligation at this moment in history, at this critical turning point in our nation and in the world, is to use that privilege for good. So what does that mean? Well, that means a few things. It means that at the moments where you know you have been silent in the face of injustice, whether that's the moment where you've been talked over in a meeting, or the moment where every woman I've ever worked with reports this. You've come up with a brilliant idea in a meeting, it gets elided over, and 5 minutes later there's a guy who claims the idea for himself, and everyone goes, that's fantastic. If you have witnessed those moments, if you have seen other people do it, and you are not shouting that out, that's an opportunity to leverage your privilege. If you work in an organization where there isn't equitable representation at the top, have you called that out to people in the organization? If you are a person already in power, are you listening to the folks in your organization who historically have been silenced and marginalized about what they are witnessing within the organization? For that matter, are you listening to that in the world? Because all of us have an opportunity right now to make a change. And to me, one of the most critical things that we can do from positions of privilege is something that I call holding the door. So I have this very dear friend who is a business advisor and also kind of walks a little bit of a mystic path. And she's very big on the aspects of women's history that have been erased. And one of the things that she has researched and talked about is that in matriarchal societies, and particularly in societies where women were priestesses or medicine women or healers, there were gathering places where women were allowed to practice these arts, to practice their leadership, and be safe. But one of the keys to that experience in many of those cultures is that there were guardians at the temple door, guardians at the outside of the tent. And what those people did as guardians, sometimes they were men, sometimes they weren't, were two things. They held the door so that women could enter the tent or the temple and do the good work. They also guarded the door to make sure that any forces that sought to tear down that power could not enter. To me, this has become a huge metaphor for how we can leverage our privilege. We must hold the door for others who have historically not had access to power. And one of the things that means is that we have to do our own work about our own biases. If you have not looked at the way in which racism has impacted who you are as a human being, because it's impacted all of us, you may not be aware enough to know what you can do to uplift women of color and people of color in your workplace. You may not even know when you are engaging in interpersonal bias yourself. So this starts from the position of being able to recognize your own work and then to hold the door for others. Simultaneously, once you are a part of the process of allowing those who have historically been silenced and not had access to power to get there, you must be the guardian against the forces currently in power who will seek to tear it down, because inevitably it will happen. One of the key things that I've learned this year that I find so important is that ceding power when you are in a position of privilege feels like loss. This is why, for instance, in my opinion, we hear so many white men saying that they're being persecuted right now. Because to cede power to those who have not had it, when you have been in power your whole life, will feel like loss. And so the key for us as allies, and I say that as a woman, as a white person, as someone who is cisgendered and straight, that the key here is that in order for us to allow a more equitable society to develop, to allow more equitable workplaces, we have to guard against the forces that will seek to prevent it because it's difficult. I will also remind you that none of this is comfortable. I think that kind of goes without saying. And another key here to speaking truth to power is that you must get used to sitting in the discomfort of it. It is a small price to pay. The personal discomfort of calling out someone's racism, sexism, bias in ways that are productive, in ways that lead to greater conversations, will be uncomfortable. But that discomfort is a necessary part of growth. And so if you are not willing to step in to the discomfort of that, you are doing yourself and all those who need you a disservice. In my view, I will also just add that at this particular moment in our society and culture, silence is complicity, because people's lives are on the line. The great Black lesbian poet Audre Lorde said extraordinary things throughout the course of her life. I have found myself turning more and more back to her work over the last couple of months. There's a speech she gave in 1977 at a women's conference where she really called out white women to consider their racism. And I really encourage all of you to go read it because it talks so much about unconscious bias and the ways in which we can all be better allies. But I keep coming back to this one particular quote of hers over the last little while, and it is this: "When I dare to be powerful, to use my strength in service of my vision, then it becomes less and less important whether I am afraid." And the key to this for me is not that I become less and less afraid, it's that it becomes less and less important whether I am afraid. So where I want to leave you at the end of this fabulous day is with the following question. What is the one, and maybe there's more, commitment that you are willing to make to speak truth to power, to create work environments, home environments, or a world that all of us can live in? My belief is that your voice can be used in the furtherance of your purpose, your mission. It can be a vehicle for change. It is ultimately a vehicle for truth. But to me, we all are in a position right now where history demands that we step forward. We will look back on this moment in time if we do not do that with a profound degree of shame. Because where we will go from here, if all of our voices are not used at this moment in time, is something that I don't even like to think about. And so I want to encourage all of you today to consider all the ways in which you can use your gifts to speak truth to power. How can you leverage your privilege? How can you hold the door? How can you shut up and be silent to have a better understanding of the experiences of others? But more than anything, how can you use your voice in furtherance of truth and justice and freedom? Because you have the capacity within this room to set the narrative and the stage for that. And history demands it right now. It just demands it. So I'm so grateful for being here. Much love to all of you. Thank you so much for this opportunity. Let's keep fighting the good fight. All right.